though, the mill had started to show its wear. Its blast furnace was no longer state-of-the-art, and rust had started creeping in. With prices stagnating across the board, and with foreign operators like those in China or Brazil willing to resort to steel dumping, reducing the market for Warren's output even more, the mill changed hands multiple times. The final company charged with steering the mill, CSC Industries, tried to turn things around, reinvesting in repairs. But little changed, and soon thereafter, CSC filed for bankruptcy. As the bankruptcy proceedings rolled on, CSC began casting around for potential buyers. One company, Warren Steel Holdings LLC, expressed interest. Registered in Delaware in 2001, representatives from the new LLC broached a potential purchase from CSC. The two sides agreed on a final number, $13.5 million, for a complete transfer of ownership of the mill to the new LLC. It's unclear how much CSC, or the city elders, knew at the time about this Delaware-registered company. But as court records would later make clear, Warren Steel Holdings LLC wasn't just another American outfit looking to pick up a competitor, trying to revitalize an aging, sagging construct whose best days were clearly behind it. Rather, Warren Steel Holdings LLC was part of the Optima International portfolio, which was connected to none other than Kolomoisky. Obtaining the Warren plant launched a spending spree. In a time when American steel manufacturing was in clear decline, Optima International began gobbling up as many American plants on offer as it could. There was a plant in the small town of New Haven, West Virginia, constructed in 1952, that Optima snapped up in early 2006 for $20 million. There was a seamless steel tube factory in South Lyon, Michigan, founded in 1927, that Optima grabbed just a couple months later. Not long thereafter, in the crease where Kentucky, West Virginia, and Ohio meet, Kolomoisky's network found a 450,000 square foot steel mill in the town of Ashland, Kentucky on the block, and shelled out a substantial $112.5 million for the plant. And soon after that, it used one of their Delaware LLCs to purchase another major plant on the opposite side of the state, in a tiny place called Calvert City, population 2,566. Final sale price for this 400,000 square foot plant, $188.1 million. In the span of just a few years, Kolomoisky's network had collected a half-dozen major mills across the American heartland, each of them the beating economic hearts of the surrounding regions. All of them had fallen casualty to America's years-long manufacturing slump, part of America's broader deindustrialization that began in the 1970s. All of them were eager for any injection of financing they could get, and for any promise of a brighter future, no matter the source of the income. And all of them were now connected directly to Kolomoisky's network, to this corporate lattice of shell companies, including some in Delaware. When the 9-figure purchasing spree was through, Kolomoisky had cemented his role as a global kingmaker, so much so that he at one point controlled over half of the U.S.'s production of silicomanganese, one of the key ingredients in producing high-grade structural steel. It remains unclear how Kolomoisky and Korff identified the specific plants to purchase, but it's clear that Korff played a key role in directing operations. Mati just cares about data and money, one American broker who worked with Korff, who requested anonymity because of litigation connected to Korff and Kolomoisky, told me. He can be in a basement for a week, get a little sunlight, and then go back out. He's the brains behind it all. But for the Ukrainian oligarch, seizing chunks of American metal manufacturing was never the end goal of his American operations, which is why he needed one more American to help him navigate a new American market that was suddenly opening itself to the pools of wealth spilling out of the former Soviet Union. He needed Chaim Shokut. According to those who've met him, Shokut is, by nature, a man prone to fidgeting. He fidgets when you sit with him, glancing constantly at his iPhone. He fidgets when you speak with him, deflecting questions with jokes and sarcasm, giving an impression that he's simultaneously aloof and awash in nerves. Confidence is, on the whole, not a characteristic most ascribed to Shokut. He has always been more of a follower than a leader. As one American real estate agent who knew him told me, Shokut always seemed like a whipping boy. Or as another person told me, I don't know how savvy Chaim ultimately is. Emerging from much the same world that Korf and his family helped create in South Florida, Shokit, the sixth of 8 children, never exhibited much drive in his younger days. He waffled through the Rabbinical College of America, bouncing between Miami and New York and Toronto, graduating with a Judaic Studies degree in 2006. Unsure of his next steps, Shokit traveled to Singapore for a year of volunteer work. When he returned to South Florida, as the U.S. tipped headlong into the Great Recession, Shokit began pulling on family connections to try to land work. He'd met a young woman, Rachel, and began a courtship that would soon result in marriage and a pair of twin boys soon after. Along the way, Shokit got to know one of Rachel's dour, workaholic brothers, who always seemed to be juggling new projects, new trips, and new instructions from partners in Ukraine. It was Moti Korf. Shokit had previously dabbled in real estate and architecture, with a hobby of sketching potential projects on the side. "I've always had a thing for architecture," he told a journalist in 2012. "I always was fascinated when they put up big buildings, little buildings, monumental buildings, and then, I guess from that, it evolved into wanting to work with them." "I doubt any of the sketches would pass code approvals," Shokit sheepishly added. But he saw an opportunity with his new brother-in-law and pitched his services. Why not let him try to turn some of that interest in architecture and real estate into something worthwhile? Why not use him as a footman, as a bagman, as someone willing to slog across the country to help scout new places to invest Optima's and Kolomoisky's money? Chaim wanted to get into the business, and Moti said no, 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 no. One American who worked with them both said. Chaim finally broke him down. By the time Shokit joined, Optima was already well established in the American steel market, but Kolomoisky wanted a foothold elsewhere. He wanted another market to dominate, and another place to park his money, safe from any Ukrainian authorities or investigators who may begin snooping around. A market that wouldn't attract any attention. He'd already saturated the steel market with his money. What about real estate? Kolomoisky's American helpers scouted parts of Kentucky and Texas. But one market in particular kept catching their eye: Cleveland. Like nearby Warren, Cleveland's best days were clearly in the rearview mirror, especially when it came to a dying downtown buffeted by both population declines and a rampaging recession. And it turned out that Shokit, according to at least one person who worked with him, happened to have friends who were studying there already. Why not have Shokit see if he could prove his worth to Kolomoisky and to Korf in Cleveland? In the midst of the recession, Shokit came into our market, and he and Korf basically portrayed themselves as Miami-based money managers involved in manufacturing businesses who had some sources of foreign money they were interested in investing in U.S. real estate. David Browning, a local broker, remembered. It was clear that Shokit wasn't like other potential buyers. He was 22, another broker recalled, and was trying to have these professional meetings in designer jeans. It was just odd. But Cleveland couldn't turn him away. He was, as one real estate agent said, the first out-of-town money for Cleveland, at least in any substantial measure. And for a city reeling from the Great Recession, Shokit was a godsend. He claimed he was fronting family money, made off profits from distant Soviet gas wells. Those in Cleveland, though, didn't care what his story was. They were more than happy to help him spend that family money however he saw fit, as we'll revisit in the book's 3rd section. Soon he was neck-deep in the Cleveland market, dominating not just downtown, but the city as a whole, fronting as a family man just looking to get his city back up on its feet. I can tell you that he's a person who cares about the city of Cleveland and wants it to do well, one local real estate agent, Mark Vogel, would later say. But for those who worked with him, though, there was a clearly different and far darker side to Shokit's public claims. In time, his fidgety habits soon turned into something else completely: fear. Chaim would come in, one real estate agent told me, and he would say, "You have no idea the people I have to deal with. If I can't come through, I could be in big trouble. Basically, they said they could kill me." Chapter 5. Slap in the Face. I understand the Interior Department is just about to close a contract to lease Teapot Dome, and all through the industry it smells. I do feel that you should tell the president that it smells. Walter Teagle. For years, The U.S. has looked the other way when it comes to the flood of dirty money racing into the country to be washed clean. It ignored how anonymous American shell companies could move money into any asset they wanted, into, as we'll see, real estate and investment funds, and luxury goods and priceless art, while stripping the names and identities of those who actually controlled the shells. It ignored how the kinds of American, business-friendly reforms Dan Zwanitzer mentioned were, in reality, attracting billions of dollars in untraceable funds to the U.S., barreling through any safeguards that may have been in place. It ignored how America's financial sectors began seeing tidal waves of dirty money joining the tidal waves of legitimate funds flooding the country, part of an ocean of international capital looking for a home. But the U.S. has known about the issue for decades, as the saga of the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI, can attest. Founded in the mid-1970s by a Pakistani banker named Agha Hassan Abedi, and bankrolled by a United Arab Emirates leader named Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan, BCCI was always supposed to be different. It pitched itself to international clients from South Asia to South America as the go-to bank for the post-colonial Third World. No Westerners would be connected to the bank. Instead, the bank would be the first of its kind, a major financial player dedicated solely to the stability and growth of forgotten markets, specifically for small-scale depositors in pockets of the world Western bankers had long overlooked. For over a decade, that pitch worked. Starting from a few locations in Pakistan and the United Arab Emirates, BCCI swelled into a behemoth of the post-colonial banking world, eventually operating by the late 1980s in over 70 countries and holding some $20 billion, about $50 billion in 2020 dollars, in total assets. BCCI, by all appearances, looked well on its way to Abedi's goal of becoming the world's largest bank by the year 2000. Most impressively, the bank swelled to such size by apparently bucking the practices of its Western peers. Instead of targeting profit margins and attracting deep-pocketed patrons, the bank claimed a different model entirely, one infused with morality above all else. No material end can be achieved without a moral aspect behind it, Abedi once said, adding another time that the spirit of BCCI is permeated by a moral dimension, and this eases the burden of management. In that vein, BCCI founded something called the Third World Foundation, which it said would help relieve poverty and sickness in the developing world, and even created an award to mirror the Nobel Peace Prize. It eventually opened branches in places like the U.S. and the U.K., whose domestic banking industries looked askance at BCCI's model. Thus, when BCCI collapsed in early 1991 under the weight of unprecedented money laundering and embezzlement allegations totaling nearly $10 billion, the waves of surprise circled the globe, bouncing between hemispheres and governments who'd never second-guessed Abedi and his bank. Morality, it seemed, couldn't quite stop Abedi and his buddies from pocketing billions of dollars they'd stolen from depositors. Issuing doctored statements, lying widely to the public, Abedi and his cronies had effectively turned the bank into a Ponzi scheme, claiming the bank held the assets that insiders had secretly stolen. Abedi and his associates had cynically turned a third-world institution into a mechanism for robbing depositors from developing countries, journalists Peter Truel and Larry Gerwin wrote in 1992. And the beneficiaries were rich sheikhs from the Persian Gulf, BCCI's associates around the world, and the bank's own management. Billions of dollars had simply disappeared, pocketed by the Saudi officials and Emirati sheikhs, as well as by clients like Saddam Hussein, Ferdinand Marcos, and Panamanian president-turned-drug kingpin Manuel Noriega, who had steered BCCI into the ether and then into the ground. BCCI's collapse was, as U.S. Attorney Robert Morgenthau said, the largest bank fraud in history. Later investigations unspooled exactly how BCCI operated, setting up sham shell companies to hide its executives' financial tracks, even setting up dummy corporations to purchase other legitimate banks elsewhere, turning them into unsuspecting prongs of Abedi's Ponzi scheme and laundering the proceeds across the West. These investigations also revealed just how close BCCI higher-ups got to people like U.S. President Jimmy Carter, how BCCI affiliates helped bankroll things like Senator Gary Hart's 1988 presidential campaign, and how journalists investigating BCCI ended up beaten and bloodied on the streets of London, their findings stolen, forever unpublished. In scope and scale, there was nothing like BCCI's collapse. But beyond the final numbers, one thing was clear. BCCI had created a blueprint that numerous kleptocrats and international criminals would soon follow. It was one of the earliest case studies in what would grow into the modern kleptocracy playbook, which targeted the West for all of its money laundering and offshoring needs. It was also a clear, blinking red light indicating that the kinds of deregulatory reforms sweeping the West, which were still ascendant at the end of the Cold War as entire new regions began getting their first whiffs of capitalism, wouldn't attract only clean, legitimate capital to the U.S., but would act like a beacon for all the dirty money starting to slosh around the globe. For decades, international money laundering, the transformation of dirty money into clean, was largely an afterthought in Washington. There was some acknowledgement that, say, Colombian cartels or Central African smugglers needed to wash their profits clean, and that they sometimes splurged on things like private jets or Miami condos with those profits. But looking over some of the late Cold War legislation, which rarely targeted high-level financial malfeasance, shows just how indifferent Washington was to the threat of transnational money laundering. For instance, it wasn't until 1970 that the U.S. passed the Bank Secrecy Act, BSA, which presented the first real reforms aimed at addressing some of the dirty money flowing into American banks. At the time, the banking sector roared with righteous indignation. Who was Washington to try to regulate the banks? Who were these bureaucrats to tell American banks who they could or couldn't deal with? The whole idea of banking was, we're bankers, we're not responsible for the actions of our customers. Jack Blum, a former Senate investigator who worked closely in drafting later anti-money laundering legislation, told me. And those bankers at the time had a point. Blum added, there was 200 years of common law and statutory law in places like New York that literally absolved bankers from responsibility for anything their customers did. But in hindsight, it's almost laughable just how small those BSA regulations were. American banks were simply required to file currency transaction reports for anything exceeding $10,000 per day. Even then, those regulations didn't prevent American banks from working with any customer they wanted, no matter the size or source of their till. Nor were those regulations even enforced for the decade or so after the BSA's inception. By the 1980s, transnational money laundering had gained a few more eyeballs in Washington, leading to the 1986 passage of the Money Laundering Control Act. On its face, the law was a significant moment for combating money laundering. As one later Senate hearing noted, it was the first law in the world to make money laundering an independent crime. Or put another way, before 1986, there was no law in the entire world that specifically criminalized money laundering. The new law explicitly prohibited any financial transaction involving the proceeds from crimes like drug trafficking, fraud, and terrorism. It also opened up every type of asset, planes, cars, jet skis, Elvis Presley's used guitars, autographed Portland Trail Blazers jerseys, and the like, to civil forfeiture, allowing the government to seize the assets even if no one was charged with a crime. A few years later, the U.S.'s anti-money laundering regime tightened further. Follow-up legislation increased penalties on banks that knowingly aided money launderers, creating new reporting requirements that compelled banks to file suspicious activity reports, SARs, with the federal government whenever they suspected clients of using their services for money laundering. But as with the BSA, the legislation was meaningless without enforcement. Even the new SAR requirements only opened up more holes. The new law required American banks to fill out a SAR, disclosing who the customer was, what they deposited, what type of wrongdoing bank employees suspected, whether they'd tried to bribe the teller, etc., and file it with the Treasury Department. Beyond that, the banks had no other legal obligations. Once they filed the SAR about a certain client, they could continue to work with that client. Even if that client had, say, just identified themselves as Pablo Escobar's sister or Slobodan Milosevic's nephew, or dragged in a dozen duffel bags full of shrink-wrapped bills. Bankers should be on the lookout for suspicious financial flows, the government said, but they don't need to actually stop working with those suspicious figures. U.S. banks can file the SAR and get on with the business, the anti-corruption watchdog Global Witness once wrote. It is up to law enforcement to act on the SAR and to follow the trail after the money is gone. But if the authorities are overworked or asleep and do not follow up the information in the SAR, the bank can effectively do business with a corrupt dictator's son with impunity as long as it continues to file a SAR for each suspect transaction. For years throughout the late Cold War period, this was how American banking operated. A banker might lose a few minutes filling out SAR paperwork, and then they could get back to tending to whichever customers they wanted. It was more of a formality than anything else, and that was only when a banker thought anything was suspicious. But then, with the implosion of BCCI in the early 1990s came all manner of revelations, from the fact that BCCI's affiliates had covertly paid off prominent Democratic politicos to the fact that BCCI secretly managed a number of American banks while simultaneously clearing checks for dictators like Pakistani leader Zia-ul Haq. Perhaps the most staggering revelations, though, centered less on BCCI and more on how little things like the BSA or the Money Laundering Control Act had done to stem the flow of suspicious and dirty money directly into American banks, American territory, and American hands. Before the BCCI affair, foreign banks were allowed to operate in the U.S. in a way that was unregulated, period. Blum, who as an investigator with Senator John Kerry's staff had helped drive the questions and pressure that finally broke BCCI's back, told me. In theory, foreign banks were regulated by their home governments, but at the time, the U.S. said, look, as long as you don't take on American customers, we won't bother you. And that's how BCCI operated. Blum's never been one to mince words. He once described a sweetheart deal American authorities offered to BCCI as a fucking outrage. It was as if $1 billion light bulb had suddenly gone off over the heads of policymakers in Washington. The BCCI scandal wrenched Washington's attention toward a burgeoning field, kleptocracy, and America's role therein. Suddenly, U.S. federal authorities had to confront the proposition that banks theoretically within their purview were running criminal enterprises, Blum added. Once that was on the table, suddenly the question of the regulation of foreign bank operations in the U.S. became a serious matter of concern. And powerful voices in Washington took note. Around the same time, the George H.W. Bush administration, spearheaded by the president himself, led efforts to establish the Financial Action Task Force, FATF. Creating international standards against money laundering, the FATF represented a groundbreaking, multilateral effort to coordinate governments against illicit networks. Over 3 decades later, the FATF remains, by all measures, the foremost international body dedicated to organizing such anti-money laundering regulations and principles, and to convincing recalcitrant governments to sign on to basic transparency protocols. With prominent voices like Kerry publicly highlighting the growing threat of international money laundering and how it helped dictators like Panama's Manuel Noriega or Iraq's Saddam Hussein hide and fund their operations, the U.S. seemed poised to clamp down on these illicit financial networks. But not everyone was on board. Blum recalled one moment toward the end of the first Bush administration, even after Bush had helped launch the FATF. There was an assistant secretary of the Treasury who, while Kerry was pushing an anti-money laundering bill on the floor, was standing outside and yelling at me and other members of Kerry's staff that we were going to destroy American finance for all time, Blum said. The assistant secretary was hysterical, saying, "Oh my God, you can't do this. You'll destroy the American economy." We kind of just laughed at the guy. It was pathetic. Still, concerns about cratering American finance, about cutting off the inflow of international money into American banks, were enough to stall those initial efforts at reform. Not that there wasn't a logic to opponents' arguments. With so much international capital flowing into the U.S., they argued, any potential new oversight and regulations could have cascading effects on both legitimate and illicit flows alike. And given that the dirty money followed the same paths as legitimate financial flows, any effort to cut off the tap of illicit monies would invariably slow down the legitimate flows. And in a country whose pro-business ethos still reigned, that was a non-starter. At least, that's what pro-business voices opposed to anti-money laundering regulations claimed. But the incoming Clinton administration was interested, both as a matter of national security and a means of claiming anti-corruption leadership. As journalist Misha Glenny observed, The Clinton administration elevated its anti-money laundering strategy to a list of its most solemn commandments. The White House launched a campaign to get international allies to criminalize things like foreign bribery, which had previously been, incredibly, tax-deductible for officials and businessmen from allies like France and Germany. The Cold War was over, and suddenly transnational money laundering, the underpinning of what we'd eventually describe as kleptocracy, loomed as an ever-increasing threat. Nor was the new administration the only branch in Washington suddenly grasping just how wide open America appeared to foreign dirty money. In the Senate, one subcommittee in particular took interest. The Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, PSI, enjoyed a lengthy, if checkered, history. Launched during the Truman administration, the PSI was composed of a bipartisan slate of senators dedicated to, as the name implied, congressional investigations. It initially examined everything from World War II profiteering to Nazi war criminals. That promising start was quickly derailed, however, when Wisconsin Senator Joe McCarthy corralled the PSI in his embarrassing pursuit of supposedly covert communists. Thankfully, the PSI shook off the taint of McCarthyism and eventually launched investigations into a wide range of topics, including the Italian-American mafia, pension and credit card fraud, corruption in the U.S. military, and even abuses in federal student aid programs. The PSI's successes ran wide. PSI stands for Pretty Scary Investigations, an opponent once quipped. Things like the Money Laundering Control Act were direct outgrowths of the PSI's investigations and public hearings, as was the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations, RICO, legislation, which effectively buried the Italian-American mafia as an organized crime force in the U.S. By the mid-1990s, the PSI was scouring for new investigative territory. And there stood the BCCI revelations, about modern offshoring, about transnational money laundering, and about all of their handmaidens along the way. The PSI started looking into some of the money laundering and offshore banking schemes gaining interest in Washington. Toward the end of the decade, the PSI's interest in this new world of foreign, dirty money received a significant boost when a new voice joined its ranks, a man who would eventually become the face of America's anti-money laundering efforts. Michigan Senator Carl Levin, broad-faced and bespectacled, first joined the Senate as a Democrat in 1979. By the time he rose to become Michigan's senior senator in the mid-1990s, he'd gained a reputation as a fan of plain talk and due diligence. Facts have always been Levin's stock in trade, one observer noted. When looking for committee assignments, there was one logical slot for him to put that talent to work: the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. Joining the PSI as the ranking minority member, Levin's investigative antennae quickly pointed in one direction: money laundering, and who was profiting from it, and how to stop it before it all ended in disaster. Senator Levin got hooked on the anti-money laundering aspect of the work we could do, one of his staff told me. It didn't take long for him to make his mark. In just a few years, Levin revolutionized America's entire anti-money laundering regime, and the timing was propitious. Just as he was joining the PSI, an entirely different affair, just beyond America's southern border, confirmed suspicions that transnational money laundering was more important than many had previously assumed. In 1995, Mexican police arrested Raul Salinas, the elder brother of the recently ousted Mexican president, on murder allegations. According to Mexican authorities, Salinas had offed his brother-in-law, who was himself a prominent Mexican politico. The case already generated enough drama, but shortly thereafter, Salinas' spooked wife fled for Switzerland, where she was arrested amidst her efforts to withdraw some $84 million from the Swiss bank, Banque Pictet. Not long thereafter, Swiss authorities revealed that Salinas' in-country assets totaled some $114 million. Needless to say, Salinas couldn't account for the vast bulk of his wealth, and much of it was safely assumed to be dirty due to high-level corruption in Mexico. Mexican first families are paid well, but not that well. More interestingly, documents pertaining to these Swiss holdings revealed that some of Salinas' ill-gotten money had taken a circuitous route to Zurich, and that much of it had traveled directly via a major American bank, Citibank. Citibank had helped move the funds from Mexico to New York before they landed in accounts at Citibank's Swiss branch, ready to be used by Salinas and his wife. For Levin and his staff, Salinas's case was the perfect mixture of intrigue and proximity. American authorities could hardly ignore such staggering corruption and its political implications out of Mexico City. Plus, there was Citibank, one of America's flagship financial entities, suddenly twisting in the wind, trying to disclaim any connection to Salinas. Levin's money laundering moth had suddenly found its flame, and his staff immediately began requesting and pouring through as many documents as they could find. It didn't take long to outline just how Citibank had actively aided and abetted Salinas's sprawling money laundering network. As Levin and his team uncovered, Salinas had relied heavily on one Citibank banker in particular, named Amy Elliott. Elliott helped steer Citibank's private banking arm, a department that specifically catered to high-net-worth individuals, no matter the source of their income. Elliott opened up myriad Citibank bank accounts for Salinas's operations in New York and Switzerland alike. Whenever Salinas or his wife presented cashier's checks from other Mexican banks to Citibank's Mexico City branch, the local branch manager would promptly wire the funds to New York, where Elliott would then take the reins, funneling the funds on to Switzerland or London for Salinas's use. Elliott, in effect, acted directly as Salinas's money manager. But it wasn't just transferring ludicrously large sums of money. Elliott and her Citibank colleagues, looking to protect their clients' requests for secrecy, made sure that Salinas's name was never attached to any of the accounts. Instead, Citibank assigned Salinas an anonymous shell company to act as the account holder. Elliott dubbed Salinas confidential client number 2 in internal communications, and even opened an account for him under the fictitious name of Bonaparte. After Levin and his staff began probing the payments, Citibank's defense waffled. The bank initially claimed ineptitude, stating that they had no idea about any of the corruption allegations swirling Salinas. They then moved to outright obstinance, with bank officials stating time and again that they'd done nothing wrong. And in a strictly legal sense, they weren't necessarily wrong. Even if they'd known the funds stemmed directly from the Salinas family's rank corruption, there was nothing on the American books making it illegal to handle the funds, including setting up anonymous shell companies for their owners. In shepherding Salinas along, Elliott had technically followed the law. As long as they filed their SARs, the only legal requirement at the time when it came to American banks handling the proceeds of foreign corruption, they could effectively help Salinas launder as much money as he could get his hands on. Even if its private banker had known that some deposits were the product of foreign corruption, U.S. anti-money laundering laws did not prohibit Citibank from accepting those funds. Elise Bean, one of Levin's lead staff investigators, later wrote, "At the time, it wasn't against the law for U.S. banks to knowingly accept corruption proceeds as bank deposits, so long as the corrupt acts took place outside U.S. borders." But the PSI investigations found that Salinas was hardly Citibank's only corrupt client. There was Citibank's private bank in New York setting up shell companies for the decades-long dictator of the African country of Gabon, with internal documents describing his staggering wealth as self-made. The bank was doing the same for the family of Nigeria's military dictator, helping him and his cronies move and conceal tens of millions of dollars looted from Nigeria's national treasury. So many examples emerged that one of the PSI investigators, according to Bean, suggested a new investigative theory which he called the unitary theory of evil. It postulated that, if you looked hard enough during those years, you might find Citibank as the financier behind many of the big-time corrupt dictators around the globe. As Levin told me, carrying on these kinds of activities is just a slap in the face of every American taxpayer. But as Levin and his staff came to realize, Citibank was hardly the lone American bank playing this role. Thanks to the whopping loopholes in things like the BSA and the Money Laundering Control Act, American banks could freely work with whomever they chose, or with whichever anonymous shell company they wanted, no matter whom those shell companies concealed. And they had every incentive to. After all, the demand was clearly there. Kleptocrats around the world were increasingly looking to move their money, hide their money, offshore their money. The demand only continued rising. And American banks, which took a cut of the proceeds they were moving, had every reason to welcome as much dirty money as they could find. There was no regulatory apparatus, no series of laws or oversight bodies to stop them. For those in the corporate suites, for those in middle management, for those interacting with the customers, the incentive pointed in one direction: increasing revenue streams. And anything that didn't explicitly break American law was fair game. It wasn't malicious, per se, and in many instances, aside from bank officials interacting directly with the corrupt officials, those on the American side of things didn't know, couldn't know, whose money they were helping move. It was a dynamic that we'll see play out time and again throughout this book and through this story of kleptocracy. As the demand side rose, and as the tides of dirty money continued to swell, incentives to provide laundering and financial secrecy tools, those supply-side instruments of modern kleptocracy, rose as well. And anyway, if giants like Citibank were already catering to the world's worst, and, until Levin's inquiry, doing it perfectly freely, why shouldn't the rest of the American banks? Why should Citibank be the only one to get a piece of this growing, dirty money pie? From there, Levin and his staff's findings only continued to pile up. They discovered that American banks, for instance, routinely set up correspondent accounts in the names of foreign banks within American banks. These effectively allowed foreign banks to operate from within their American partners. But because they were still foreign banks in control of those accounts, they weren't subject to even minimal U.S. anti-money laundering regulations. As an added bonus, American authorities didn't have legal authority to seize the funds held in these correspondent accounts, even when they were housed at American banks in New York, or Miami, or Los Angeles. Even when investigators or Democratic reformers knew these accounts contained money looted by dictators, there was nothing Washington could do. It was as if U.S. authorities knew about the millions in dirty money an American bank held in its right hand, but could only freeze what the bank held in its left. One group of foreign banks that took advantage of these correspondent accounts were known as shell banks. These foreign shell banks didn't even bother with brick-and-mortar buildings, but existed as a bank on paper only. Despite existing only on documents, they could still open as many correspondent accounts as they liked in American banks, enjoying all of the opportunities and protections and help of American bankers like Amy Elliott, without having to worry about any pesky regulations or American authorities freezing their accounts. BCCI, for instance, set up a shell bank for just these purposes on the Caribbean island of Anguilla, a British territory that made a fortune selling shell bank licenses to anyone who came knocking. By the turn of the century, there were thousands of these shell banks scattered around the world, seeming to exist for no reason other than hiding money. U.S. banks hardly thought twice before opening an account for another bank, even if it was an offshore bank with no physical presence anywhere, operated in a secrecy jurisdiction known for sleaze, and used its U.S. account to engage in dubious transactions, Bean said. As Levin later wrote, the lackadaisical treatment was based on an assumption that a bank was a bank and could be trusted, instead of considering that some banks might be a center of corruption. The information uncovered by Levin and his staff put to rest any remaining claims that the U.S.'s anti-money laundering laws were effective. American banks had, clearly, become giant magnets for much of the world's dirty money, and existing laws made American officials impotent to do anything about it. As such, in 1999, Levin joined Republican Senator Arlen Specter to draft a bill with a range of proposed legislative fixes, including banning shell bank operations, pushing for greater oversight of correspondent accounts, and instituting basic due diligence requirements on billions of foreign dollars barreling into American banks. But the bill ended up in the Senate Banking Committee, whose chair was Texas GOP Senator Phil Gramm, some of whose key constituents were Texas-based banks that were popular destinations for the deluge of dirty money flowing north from places like Mexico and Central America. None of the members of the Texas Bankers Association, with Graham as their effective mouthpiece, saw any reason to change business as usual. Graham responded to our bill with a deafening silence, one of Levin's staff said. From there, Levin's anti-money laundering window only seemed to shrink. The election of George W. Bush revived an anti-regulatory ethos in Washington, decreasing the appetite for banking restrictions and oversight, even those advancing the anti-money laundering campaign his father's administration helped propel. For Bush and his team, the only good anti-money laundering strategy was no anti-money laundering strategy, Glenny summed. Regulations, to opponents, would only get in the way of American business, and for an economy still centered on the kind of deregulatory ethos ascendant since the 1980s, and for American industries watching billions flowing in, those regulations were a non-starter. Still, Levin didn't give up. In the summer of 2001, the senator corralled a half-dozen co-sponsors, including a number of Republicans, to launch a second, even stronger anti-money laundering bill. But just as before, Graham, at the behest of the Texas Bankers Association, welcomed the bill into his Senate Banking Committee and strangled it in the crib. And then, a few weeks later, September 11th changed everything. While the ground still smoldered in New York, Washington, D.C., and the fields of Pennsylvania, legislators and investigators in Congress suddenly scrambled. They had to figure out how transnational financial flows had helped bankroll transnational terrorism, how militant extremists deep in the caves of Afghanistan could fund the most devastating terror attack the U.S. had ever seen. How did they pay for their activities in America? How did they pay for training? How did they pay for everything that led to the worst terrorist attack in the country's history? And who had helped them do so? It didn't take long to find the answers. The attackers, as Levin testified just 2 weeks after the attack, had used cash, checks, credit cards, and wire transfers involving U.S. banks in states such as Florida, New York, and Pennsylvania, with security footage showing them freely using a U.S. bank's ATM machine. It wasn't that they were just the same tactics, the same tools that Salinas and BCCI and despots and regimes around the world had used. It was also that they were mixing their terror-tainted funds with all of the other legitimate flows in the financial system, and there would have been little way for anyone to tell the difference, to tell which monies were going to finance the attacks on that Tuesday morning. The evidence is clear that terrorists are using our own financial institutions against us, Levin concluded. None of this should have come as a surprise. But all of a sudden, in the aftermath of 9/11, the threats of unchecked dirty money financial flows finally sank in. 9/11 provided a window to push legislation, Blum remembered. Until then, every time legislation had been proposed, it didn't get anywhere. And suddenly, we had a chance to really make a difference here. As Levin told me, it was 9/11 which then gave a whole, big impetus to the issue. It was clear. The wind was at the reformers' backs. There was a 180-degree flip, one senior economist in the Bush administration said. After 9/11, no anti-money laundering regime was too strong for the U.S. Any kind of concerns about secondary effects go out the window. The brief is, everybody has to have this regime, and the stronger, the more onerous, the better. No cost is too high. Thankfully, Levin and his colleagues' previous reform packages were still viable. When a package of national security reforms began hurtling through Congress, bundled into what would be called the Patriot Act, Levin spied an opportunity. The senator convinced his counterparts that any national security reforms would have no teeth without his proposed anti-money laundering reforms. Levin, as anti-corruption crusader Raymond Baker remembered, thundered that money laundering had helped and would otherwise continue to help fund terrorist groups intent on the mass murder of Americans. Levin's anti-money laundering proposals, boosted by the support of Senator Paul Sarbanes, a Democrat who'd taken the helm of the Senate Banking Committee from Graham, joined the effort. But there was one hiccup. An old friend came to call on Levin and his allies, Citibank. Backed by the American Bankers Association, Citibank's lobbyists cornered legislators and intimidated staffers, crowing that connections between terrorism and anti-money laundering reform, despite the documents, despite the hearings, despite the footage, were negligible. How could anyone think that money had anything to do with 9/11, they asked. The lobbyists mounted a campaign bitterly opposing inclusion of strengthened anti-money laundering provisions, Baker said, and desperately wanted to continue their lucrative business. Any hope of comity disintegrated. Civility collapsed. shouting matches between Citibank officers and congressional staffers erupted in the halls of Congress. Added Baker, who later founded the Global Financial Integrity think tank, how the biggest banks in New York, following the city's most tragic event, a shattering experience for the whole of America, could go to Washington and argue against tougher anti-money laundering provisions directed in good part at terrorists is for me unfathomable. Levin, though, wasn't cowed, insisting that he'd hold up the passage of the entire Patriot Act if his provisions weren't included. He and his colleagues never buckled under the pressure from the banks. The Senate Banking Committee waved his reform proposals through unanimously. The moment those reforms finally latched on to the Patriot Act, at least being remembered, was magical. And understandably so. When Bush signed the Patriot Act into law in late October, American banks' halcyon days of serving dictators and despots and drug runners were, with a single pen stroke, over. No longer could American banks freely open accounts for shell banks, nor could they simply shuffle funds into a correspondent account to prevent seizure by U.S. authorities. No longer could they welcome whomever they wanted into their private banking divisions. Due to a provision authored by Sarbanes, American banks would have to set up their own internal anti-money laundering programs. And, at long last, handling all those proceeds of foreign corruption became a criminal offense. It addressed virtually every one of the problems identified in our 3-year money laundering investigation. Bean, who now helps run the Levin Center at Wayne State University Law School in Detroit, later wrote, "It was an oversight triumph." Added Baker, the entire slate was a stellar example of transparency-based reform. In many ways, the Patriot Act, somewhat ironically given how roundly the rest of the bill has been condemned since, is, to date, the greatest single piece of anti-money laundering legislation the U.S. and arguably the world has ever seen. But dirty money still seeps through the cracks, oozes through the loopholes, finds a way through the openings and the exemptions. Dirty money is always, always looking to be washed clean. And the Patriot Act was, despite the deserved praise on the anti-money laundering front, no different. Despite all it accomplished, it was still subject to one small, trifling loophole, which helped open a new chapter in America's grand transformation into the world's greatest offshore haven. The loophole arose from the fact that the Treasury Secretary is allowed to issue exemptions from financial regulations for financial institutions. It was like a fail-safe switch, allowing the Treasury Secretary to shield any part of the American financial sector from these new anti-money laundering checks. And it wasn't long before that switch was flipped and new exemptions suddenly came into play, and before America's anti-money laundering policies took 5 steps forward and 5 steps quickly back. In statements that few paid much attention to, lost in the din of the continued war in Afghanistan and the lead-up to the invasion of Iraq, the Bush Treasury Department announced in early 2002 that it was exempting a number of industries from these historic anti-money laundering reforms. It was a wide range. Real estate agents and those overseeing escrow accounts, managing millions and millions of dollars. Private equity and hedge fund managers, managing billions of dollars. Luxury goods vendors, those selling things like private jets and million-dollar automobiles. All of these would receive temporary exemptions from basic anti-money laundering checks, according to the Treasury Department, in order to study the effect these new requirements might have. They wouldn't have to set up any internal anti-money laundering programs. They wouldn't even have to do any due diligence on the sources of the money, or even who the money was necessarily connected to. For good measure, Treasury made clear that it also wouldn't extend the new anti-money laundering program requirements to things like American lawyers or American art dealers and auction houses either, which we'll learn plenty about in the coming chapters. The Treasury Department also batted away any questions about requiring American shell companies, all those anonymous vehicles popping up in the thousands in Delaware and Nevada and Wyoming, to identify who was behind them. There's no evidence that any of these moves were malign, or done with the express intent of expanding American money laundering services. The new legislation, after all, was a qualitatively new approach, forcing banks, a major pillar of America's economy, to enact significant reforms, redirecting resources toward new anti-money laundering policies, compelling them to finally comb through all of the legitimate and illicit assets coming in. And it wouldn't be an easy task, because the money and assets, both legitimate and illegitimate, followed the same financial pathways, which meant that suddenly, everything would get a closer look. Because no one was quite sure what effect that would have on the U.S. financial industry, Treasury wanted to make certain they weren't inadvertently tripping up entire sectors of the American economy. As such, they gave real estate and private equity and luxury goods dealers a pass until the U.S. could sort out the best approach. Until the U.S. could figure out how to keep the baby, the clean, legitimate money of international capital, while throwing out the bathwater, the dirty money increasingly winding its way into the U.S. Banks, then, were the only major American institutions that would actually have to comply with these new anti-money laundering regulations. But they weren't the only ones. Security firms, money service businesses, mutual funds, and insurance companies also had to follow suit. But those were small fry organizations, at least compared to banks and those industries enjoying these new exemptions. Yet these temporary exemptions were a gut punch to reformers. When pressed about the surprise exemptions, Treasury said it just wanted more information about how the new regulations would affect the assorted industries. Shortly thereafter, in early 2003, Treasury announced that it was requesting public comment and public input about these exemptions, part of its study of the issue, Treasury claimed. Before these regulations could be expanded, Treasury would have to make sure these regulations didn't cut American industry off at the knees. But nobody knows what the results of those public comments were. Treasury has never revealed the outcomes of its study. And 2 decades later, almost all of those temporary exemptions still remain in effect. Part 2. Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. Go get honest work. To me, they're not a whole lot better than pimps or drug dealers in suits. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, on the Americans aiding the kleptocrats. Chapter 6. Scooping Caviar with a Shovel. When I was in Equatorial Guinea the first few weeks, I asked, why are there no newspapers? And they said that the people weren't interested, that the people don't read a lot, which is also why there were no libraries. Former senior U.S. State Department official. For those in Washington, Riggs Bank, a small American bank founded in 1836, the same year Texas seceded from Mexico and Martin Van Buren was elected president, had always had a different air, a different aura about it. A small, boutique outfit, Riggs pitched itself to clients in Washington as the Bank of Presidents, catering to diplomats, politicians, and their assorted retinues. And it had the legacy to back it up. Riggs could track its clientele back to Abraham Lincoln, having helped finance everything from the invention of the telegraph to the purchase of Alaska. It was one of the oldest banks in America's capital, and was, as one write-up described it, venerable. At the turn of the 21st century, that reputation remained intact. While other banking giants spun off in new directions, Riggs' clientele appeared localized to the power players in Washington and the foreign officials passing through. Riggs was seen as a small but powerful bank, cornering a niche market, one Senate investigator told me. They serviced embassies, heads of state and family members, other officials from other countries who were living in Washington. By one estimate, Riggs, at its height, worked with over 95% of the foreign missions and embassies in and around Washington. Embassy banking, they called it. As Riggs later said, they were happy to open an account for anyone holding diplomatic credentials from the U.S. State Department. Overseen by Joseph Albritton, who'd served as the bank's director since 1981, Riggs' client list grew at a steady rate toward the end of the millennium, with its total assets reaching about $6 billion, enough to make it the largest bank based in Washington, though still far more boutique than, say, globe-spanning behemoths like Citibank. In comparison to other competitors, Riggs always remained small, and always pitched itself as the cultured, elegant bank for its cultured, elegant clientele. Then, in early 2003, the mask slipped. While investigators in Washington continued tracking the roots of the 9/11 terrorists' financing, Rumors began trickling out that they'd found links between Riggs and the suspicious Saudi money tied to the 9/11 attacks. Tens of millions of dollars connected to Saudi ambassador Prince Bandar bin Sultan and his wife intersected with dozens of accounts they maintained at Riggs, as did numerous questions about Bandar's connections to key contacts for the 9/11 terrorists. But that wasn't all. Reports surfaced that Riggs had also gotten a taste for some of the dirty money that had spent years pouring into the U.S., probing for weak spots, and that some of that money was linked to a small, despotic government in Central Africa suddenly enjoying gushes of oil wealth, without any idea what to do with it. According to the whispers, the Obiang family had found a welcome embrace from Riggs. Most importantly, they had found a way to get their money into the U.S. without any questions asked. Not far from Riggs' Washington headquarters, Senator Levin and his staff got wind of the rumors and reports about a relationship between Riggs and the Obiangs. Still at the PSI, Levin was unsatisfied with the recent Patriot Act anti-money laundering legislation he'd spent so much time pushing. Not the language, per se. The prohibitions and proscriptions were as tight as any in the world, but with compliance. A law, after all, is only as effective as its enforcement. And Levin wanted to know, were American banks actually complying with these new regulations? And were the bodies tasked with oversight, the Treasury Department most especially, actually following through? We saw that a journalist had done a piece about Equatorial Guinea and Riggs, one of Levin's investigators remembered. With the alleged connections between Riggs and the Obiangs, Levin's radar just went off. This was it, Levin said. Riggs would be their test case to examine just how effectively those new post-9/11 regulations were working, or if the American banks were still the laundromats processing dirty money tied to these putrid regimes. By March 2003, Levin and his staff began issuing subpoenas, collecting documents, and organizing interviews. In time, they would amass over 100 boxes of packed folders and electronic material, all with thousands of pages of bank statements, wire transfers, and emails, amidst their piling evidence from Riggs. And what they would find in just a year would rock activist communities and political bases from Chile to the United Kingdom, and by 2005, topple Riggs entirely, killing off Washington's most venerable bank for good. When Senate investigators began questioning the bank, Riggs initially attempted to play down its links with Equatorial Guinea. The bank revealed that it maintained a few dozen accounts on behalf of clients from the small nation, but that they were no different than any of the other accounts maintained on behalf of foreign clientele. The first account had been opened in January 1996, shortly after Equatorial Guinea's offshore oil wealth began flowing. But none of the deposits had ever raised any red flags, either then or now, Riggs said. All of the money appeared perfectly above board, the bank claimed. Levin and his staff were hardly convinced. Part of that was due to the nature of the Obiang regime in particular, buttressed as it was by torture, human rights atrocities, and corruption almost without compare. But much of that suspicion also stemmed from a middle-aged Riggs employee named Simon Carreri. In a role similar to Amy Elliott's at Citibank, Carreri had served as the private banker for a number of Riggs' clients, rising to become the bank's senior vice president. When Senate investigators scanned Riggs' accounts, Carreri's name kept popping up, time and again, for account after account after account. When Levin and his staff initially sat down with him, Carreri dodged questions about his role, or about how the relationship between Riggs and Equatorial Guinea began, and even about how the bank had handled the new Patriot Act requirements Levin had forced through. After all, American banks were now prohibited from working with the proceeds of foreign corruption. Given the mountains of evidence against the Obiang family already, how could Carreri and Riggs explain their continued work with them? Riggs, like Carreri, initially defended its ties with the Obiangs. Riggs initially said Carreri was a good guy, one Senate investigator remembered, saying that Riggs claimed they'd never had reason to doubt him and his work. But there was something in the way Carreri had feigned concern, something in the way he slow-walked answers back to the PSI investigators, that only provoked Levin and his staff. The entire staff's shady dealings radar had immediately begun pinging when it came to Carreri, one of Levin's investigators recalled. And it soon became apparent why. Levin's investigators discovered that while Riggs and Carreri had turned over certain information about the Obiang accounts, they had failed to turn over information about dozens more accounts linked to the dictator and his family. Riggs claimed, bizarrely, that their accounting system was still run manually, which was why they'd initially missed the accounts. If true, Riggs would have been the only bank in America without a fully electronic accounting system. As a result, Levin subpoenaed even more documents, this time pertaining specifically to Riggs' anti-money laundering program, which the bank was required to enact following the Patriot Act in order to make sure it wasn't processing foreign corruption proceeds. But as the new documents were coming in, Levin and his staff heard something they didn't expect. Rather than continue to appear for questions with investigators, Carreri had fled the country and had found refuge in Equatorial Guinea. At that point, Riggs immediately flipped on Carreri, pegging him as the fall guy for every misstep that the bank had taken with the Obiangs since the mid-1990s. Riggs at first said Carreri is a good guy, but all of a sudden he fled to Equatorial Guinea, and they did a 180-degree turn, one investigator told me. Carreri turned out to be a bum. The bank's tactics changed almost overnight. Carreri wasn't the reputable, upstanding guy the bank had previously claimed. He was the bad apple, suddenly turned exile. After that, the bank's attorneys rolled over, one investigator remembered. They basically said, whatever you want, you've got. New documents came cascading in. Some revealed Carreri's habit of showing up at Riggs with suitcases of shrink-wrapped bills, personally depositing millions of dollars in straight cash on behalf of the Obiangs. Quipped Levin, "If that kind of cash deposit does not make a bank sit up and ask questions, I'm not so sure anything will." Other documents detailed meetings set up by Carreri between senior Riggs officials and Obiang's aides, as well as President Obiang himself, with Albritton, the bank's longtime chief, personally overseeing a committee dedicated to expanding its relationship with the Obiang family. Indeed, the meetings between the Obiangs and the Riggs officials, and Carreri's role therein, were some of the glaringly obvious signs that Riggs knew exactly what it was doing with one of the most corrupt families Africa had ever produced. Once Senate investigators scratched the surface at Riggs, the bank's higher-ups' willingness to do whatever they could to move the Obiang's money was almost impossible to miss. Much of that has to do with the fact that when it comes to the Obiangs, subtlety is in short supply. Everything about the family's corruption is blindingly obvious. Riggs couldn't simply plead ignorance. But for most American bankers dealing with kleptocrats, for most middle managers, for most tellers, even for most executives, things would never be quite so obvious. Other kleptocratic figures simply blended in with the rest of the high-net-worth clients they were servicing. They could slip their dirty money in with the tides of legitimate finance continually flowing into the country. Differentiating the two was all too often above the pay grade of a banker dealing with dozens of clients per week, difficult to parse, even on the best of days. All of which is to say, if the Obiangs could get away with their dirty money flows at a bank like Riggs for years and years, stopped only by a high-profile Senate investigation, what did other, less conspicuous kleptocrats have to worry about? But it wasn't just Carreri's efforts to funnel as much of Obiang's money as he could to Riggs. As other documents revealed, and as we saw with Citibank and its dirty clients, Riggs' employees had helped Obiang set up several shell companies to further obscure their money on the off chance anyone came looking. The main shell company, called Otong Limited, was registered in the Bahamas in 1999. Time and again, Riggs accepted million-dollar cash deposits meant for the Obiang family on the shell company's behalf, including in 2002, well after the new Patriot Act provisions went into force. Riggs claimed that Otong was an exporter of timber, despite knowing full well that the shell company had no employees and was little more than a front for President Obiang. Riggs' documents also claimed that the Obiang family made their money from cocoa farming and businesses, and didn't say anything about the fact that the family oversaw a horrific dictatorship. Nor was that all. Levin and his staff found that Riggs had additionally opened accounts for payments from American oil companies owed to Obiang and his regime. That is, rather than depositing payments for oil extraction with, say, Equatorial Guinea's treasury, the Obiangs directed the companies to route those millions into their U.S. accounts at Riggs for their personal use, a setup that Riggs facilitated. And that money could then be withdrawn perfectly easily with a simple signature from either President Obiang, who would stop by on his trips to Washington, or from his wayward son. When the tabulations finally stopped and the documents finally ran out, the findings were staggering. From 1995 through 2003, Riggs hosted a mountainous $700 million for the Obiang regime in dozens of different accounts, all of it presumably dirty, made from embezzlement, corruption, and the perks of being a dictator. Riggs allowed the Obiang family to cycle their dirty funds through the bank and withdraw it on the other side as perfectly clean money, complete with the imprimatur of the Bank of Presidents, to be spent on anything they liked. The bank was, in essence, a bottomless ATM for the family. More astonishingly, that total amount made the Obiang regime the largest single client of Riggs Bank. By the early 2000s, Riggs had gone from relying on American presidents and their entourages to leaning heavily on one of the most corrupt regimes on the planet. Perhaps most remarkable, the bank hadn't flagged a single one of the dozens and dozens of accounts as high risk, or subjected them to any additional scrutiny as regulations required. Given the fees the bank charged the Obiangs to host their money, it was best, Riggs decided, not to look a kleptocratic gift horse in the mouth. We have a dictator here who is, according to the reports that you can read and I can read, someone who is a human rights violator and who runs a country as though it is his own private fiefdom, Levin would say in a 2004 hearing on his staff's findings. But I have to tell you, I do not see any fundamental difference between dealing with an Obiang and dealing with a Saddam Hussein. On their face, the stories Levin and his staff unearthed regarding Riggs and Citibank were little different. Both involved private bankers who ran wild with their ludicrously corrupt customers, helping them set up shell companies to cover their tracks, obscuring their ties in public, and making millions while freely processing gobsmacking amounts of dirty foreign money. Like Citibank, Riggs had actively assisted some of the most corrupt customers on earth. And also like Citibank, Riggs tried to keep the pipeline open as long as it could, no matter the source of the income. There was one difference, though, between Citibank's ties with noxious regimes and foreign crooks and Riggs' transformation into the Obiang's preferred money laundering vehicle, the law. Citibank had gone about its malfeasance before those Patriot Act provisions had placed new restrictions on America's banking sector. Riggs, however, simply pretended that those new restrictions never took place. As Levin later said, Riggs ignored its anti-money laundering obligations before the Patriot Act and continued to ignore them afterward. As Riggs and the Obiangs so clearly illustrated, when an onrush of dirty foreign money floods Washington, it can overcome even the kinds of anti-money laundering laws that have both momentum and public support behind them. As Levin and the PSI learned in their inquiry, Riggs had not only continued processing the Obiang's dirty money through the entire saga of the passage of the Patriot Act, but it hadn't even bothered to flag any of the Obiang-related accounts as high risk until late 2003, well after the first suspicions about the bank's foreign ties began trickling out and after Senate investigators had already begun asking questions. And it soon became clear why. Part of the banking regulations required officials at the Treasury Department to oversee compliance with anti-money laundering procedures. In the case of a client like the Obiangs, those regulations centered on making sure that the bank wasn't servicing the proceeds of foreign corruption, that the accounts the bank held on behalf of foreign officials appeared to match what could be expected of those foreign officials' incomes and assets. And if those at the bank are clearly turning a blind eye, as those at Riggs did time and again with the Obiangs, American regulators tasked with making sure banks complied with these anti-money laundering procedures were supposed to clamp down and make sure the new measures were followed. But the American officials in charge of monitoring Riggs weren't simply asleep on the job. They actively swept Riggs' practices under the rug. They, in effect, colluded with Riggs' transformation into a laundromat for the Obiangs. As the Senate investigators uncovered, the U.S. official charged with overseeing Riggs' compliance, known as the Examiner in Charge, EIC, working out of the Treasury Department's Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, OCC, appeared to have become more of an advocate for the bank than an arm's-length regulator. The official, R. Ashley Lee, worked as Riggs' EIC for several years, including through the post-9/11 debates just a few halls away on the U.S.'s new anti-money laundering regulations. For Lee, though, those regulations were apparently little more than suggestions, ones he could freely ignore as he saw fit. Lee apparently thought that because no one had necessarily taken banking regulations seriously before, at least when it came to handling foreign corrupt monies, there was little reason to think they would start now. On multiple instances, Lee recommended against taking any action against Riggs. Even with numerous internal complaints from anti-money laundering bank examiners watching the Obiangs move their money through Riggs, Lee did nothing. As one of Lee's employees wrote him, Riggs's clear breach of anti-money laundering provisions compels me to formally express my fear of what we have yet to uncover at this bank. Yet Lee kept approving the bank's operations and stalling any disciplinary action every time he had a chance. Lee claimed that the bank had promised to correct identified anti-money laundering deficiencies, and that Riggs was planning to remedy the identified deficiencies. Year after year went by, though, with nothing changing. If that had been all, Lee would have come out of the PSI investigation looking like a dupe, his ineptitude matched only by Riggs's greed. But there was another angle to the relationship, as Levin and his staff uncovered. When Lee announced he was retiring as EIC in 2002, Riggs immediately swooped in and offered Lee a new and lucrative management position. Lee was technically free to take the position, however unseemly it looked from the outside. After all, he'd hardly be the first bureaucrat to capitalize on a cozy relationship with the entity he was supposed to be overseeing. But federal post-employment regulations barred any sit-down meetings between former officials and the bank regulators for at least 2 years, a restriction Lee apparently ignored, appearing almost immediately after he left the government as an official representative of Riggs. Lee, remarkably, didn't deny his presence at these meetings, but his defense bordered on the absurd. As a later Senate report noted, when the PSI asked him about these meetings, Mr. Lee acknowledged attending them, but claimed that he made a deliberate decision not to speak at them so that he would not violate the post-employment ban. In other words, after remaining silent on Riggs's laundering for years, Lee remained silent when he was officially in Riggs's employ. It was a clear case of what's known as regulatory capture, when industry and officials become so cozy with one another that any dividing lines effectively disappear. The relationship between Riggs and Lee was hardly the first example of this happening, but given the hundreds of millions of dollars making up the Obiang's relationship with Riggs, it was perhaps the most expensive instance of regulatory capture in American history. There was one other key discovery in the PSI's deep dive into Riggs, which neither Levin nor any of the members of his staff ever expected to find. With hundreds of boxes, thousands of documents, and even more potential leads to sift through, Levin needed as many hands as he could find for the examination of Riggs. One of those tapped for help was Laura Stuber, known as a dogged PSI forensic investigator. During the inquiry, Stuber spent time combing through some of the account ledgers Riggs had delivered, looking for names that might lead somewhere. There was one that caught her eye. There were some ledgers that said, "Oh, Pinochet," and I said, "Oh, that's interesting." Stuber, now working for the California Attorney General's office, told me. Pinochet, the last name of Augusto Pinochet, the grisly, decades-long military dictator in the South American country of Chile, responsible for the country's 1973 coup and for a regime that killed thousands. Another of Pinochet's claims to fame, launching a successful assassination campaign against political opponents exiled in Washington. But his name didn't begin with an O. Maybe it was a relative or a family member. So Stuber pulled on the thread and immediately discovered that this was no family member. This was the man himself, yet another dictator who'd plowed millions upon millions of dollars into Riggs with no questions asked. Tracing the names and numbers in ledger after ledger, Stuber untangled how Pinochet had bounced his money to and through Riggs, laundering it for his own use since the mid-1990s. As she followed the money he shuffled through different banks, there were scans of different passports that Chilean strongmen used, with photos of him in various disguises, some where he was balding, some where he had a new mustache, some where he was wearing glasses. She also uncovered the different names he'd used to set up the accounts, some with variants of his own name, Augusto Pinochet Ugarte, and some in the names of Chilean military officials who'd helped buttress his brutality. There were, in total, nearly 30 accounts linked directly to the Chilean kleptocrat, all of them allowing him to continue bankrolling his lavish lifestyle after stepping down from the presidency in 1990 and promptly taking office as senator for life in the Chilean legislature. And there, in all their actuarial glory, the bank documents recorded all the ways Riggs had not only sought out Pinochet's ill-gotten money, but had helped him conceal and launder the funds, even while thousands of Pinochet's victims were demanding justice in Chile. As the documents revealed, Riggs specifically recruited Pinochet to the bank, describing his wealth in internal documents as stemming from family and salary. Just a dictator trying to make an honest living, apparently. Carol Thompson, the private banker assigned to Pinochet's accounts, met with the former dictator multiple times a year, with Riggs even providing Pinochet with offshore corporations that helped conceal his financial transfers. Even after Pinochet was finally placed under house arrest in London in 1998, with a British court ordering a freeze of all his assets, Riggs helped Pinochet work around the freeze by transferring his money through shell company accounts to keep it hidden yet accessible. In other words, Riggs helped Pinochet, again one of the late 20th century's most notorious butchers, known for tossing political opponents out of helicopters, specifically evade a court-ordered asset freeze. And there, over and over, was R. Ashley Lee. Yet again, Lee didn't bother to raise any concerns when he learned that Riggs was catering to Pinochet's financial needs. In one remarkable incident, Lee also excluded all paperwork related to the Pinochet accounts from the OCC's own electronic database, relegating them instead to a single hard copy, effectively making the accounts all but invisible to anyone else in Treasury who may have wanted to take a look. This was about a month before Lee accepted his sparkling new job at Riggs. Remarkably, up until the PSI's findings, Pinochet had somehow escaped developing a reputation for high-level corruption. Chileans viewed him as an authoritarian figure, a bloody impediment to Chile's democratic path, but he was never seen as someone who profited from his position. And then Levin and his staff's findings came out, and that reputation completely crumbled. "We thought he was this modest guy, and it created this huge uproar in Chile," Stuber told me. "We didn't know it was going to have that big an impact. We thought it was a big deal, but didn't know it was that big." But it was. Suddenly, Pinochet's remaining reputation in Chile collapsed in on itself. The facade he'd maintained for decades, that he was interested only in order, not in lining his pockets, crumbled. His corruption was suddenly there for all to see, no longer bundled behind the benefits of American secrecy. As the story dominated Chilean headlines, whatever soft spot Pinochet may have retained among nostalgic Chileans imploded. He had a reputation of being a patriot, or of at least being an honest, ruthless dictator, Levin told me, and we destroyed that. After Levin and his staff finished sorting through the hundreds of boxes and thousands of documents and millions of financial details, the conclusions were stark. Riggs, by the mid-2000s, had transformed into a substantial engine for kleptocracy. Riggs made a mockery of claims that the Patriot Act's new anti-money laundering regulations were sufficient. Without enforcement, and with Treasury banking regulators allowed to jump ship to the banks they were supposed to be monitoring, the new legal restrictions were hardly worth the congressional paper on which they were written. Osama bin Laden boasted that his modern new recruits knew the cracks in the Western financial systems like they knew the lines in their hands, Levin said during a charged 2004 Senate hearing announcing the PSI findings on Riggs and the Obiang's corruption. That chilling statement helped fuel a new effort to strengthen our defenses against terrorists, corrupt dictators, and others who would use our financial systems against us. But the Riggs case history shows we still have a long way to go. Riggs, as it was, wouldn't get a chance to finally implement the reforms Lee had long allowed them to skirt. After coughing up over $40 million in penalties, the largest then in American history, including nearly $10 million to a fund dedicated to the thousands of victims of Pinochet's brutality, Riggs finally shuttered the Obiang-related accounts, divesting itself of its largest client. Shortly thereafter, limping along, Riggs effectively folded, selling out to another American bank. Lincoln's Bank, mortally wounded by the revelations about its money laundering machinery, was finally no more. And yet, almost none of Riggs' higher-ups spent any time in prison. Carreri, who'd christened Riggs' relationship with the Obiangs, pleaded guilty on multiple counts, including bank fraud and money laundering. But even then, he received only a 2-year sentence, not much for a banker responsible for propelling one of the most blatant money laundering schemes ever seen in the nation's capital. Yet that sentence was still more than Lee or Carroll Thompson, Pinochet's private banker, received, with both of them getting off scot-free. Albritton, Riggs' longtime head, had already resigned his position in 2002, handing over the bank's stewardship to his playboy son, Robert Albritton, who claimed ignorance of the entire affair. The younger Albritton, now the publisher of Politico, blamed his lack of awareness on the fact that he spent much of the time cavorting and skiing across Europe. In the end, the Riggs story was a bit of American kleptocracy in miniature. Even with the new laws, a member of the American financial sector, Riggs, nonetheless kept working with a series of foreign officials, the Obiangs. On its face, such a relationship mirrored its work for the bank's other clients, many of whom also sought banking security and secrecy. But there was one glaring exception. The Obiangs oversee one of the most brutal regimes on the planet. Yet the bank didn't need to worry, since the American bureaucrats supposedly overseeing the operation were in on the action. And if the American officials didn't care, then who would? The only thing Riggs didn't count on was Levin and his staff finally poking around and making an example of Riggs to the rest of the world. The Obiangs, meanwhile, simply moved on. Their Riggs accounts were no more, but their grip on Equatorial Guinea's surging oil wealth and on the levers of the country's political system never wavered. Instead, they simply sniffed out new outlets for their money laundering enterprises. The hundreds of millions in dirty money they'd piled into Riggs was suddenly in search of a new home. And a continent away, Teodorin thought he'd found a solution. Where one avenue closed, a dozen others opened. Loopholes, there to exploit. So when Levin and his staff finally closed the Riggs investigation, Teodorin returned to an old haunt, Southern California. No longer was he simply a student a million miles from home, skipping his lessons and drinking until the early morning hours. Now he was bringing with him an entire fleet of helpers, drivers and housekeepers, estate managers and professional cooks, security teams chock full of retired police officers. And it was there, in California, that Teodorin would plot his next moves for his transnational money laundering enterprise. There, as one contact said, to take full advantage of the loopholes in the Patriot Act, to splurge on as much bling and as many baubles as he could find, and on so much caviar that, as one source told the Harpers in 2009, you could have scooped it with a shovel. Chapter 7. Mensa-certified genius. We pride ourselves on being a country of asylum for those who have been persecuted or prosecuted, but we've never been a dumping ground for despots or dictators or people who have plundered a nation. Ted Kennedy. While senators held hearings on Riggs, Teodorin pulled up outside a 12-foot-high wooden gate in Southern California. Flanking him were a pair of turrets, perfect spots for guards to perch as lookouts. Palm trees leaned overhead, stretching out beyond, swaying slightly. Under a warm sun, Teodorin looked to his right, just past the palm trees, knowing that if he followed the road, he'd find homes that belonged to celebrities like Britney Spears, Mel Gibson, and Kelsey Grammer. But Teodorin wasn't interested in visiting those homes. He wanted the one that was right in front of him. Just behind the gate, a driveway wound on. On the right side, a tennis court sat unused next to a sand-colored guest house. As the driveway continued, the horizon opened up just to the left, and the Pacific Ocean came into view, stretching into the distance. Those who visited the property actually compared the view to an infinity pool. The 16-acre yard's giant, grassy sprawl ended at the edge of a sheer cliff, immediately dropping off, leaving nothing but the view. At the end of the driveway, spread out like an inverted horseshoe, was a building that was less a house than, as visitors said, a palace. Part Spanish mission, part sprawling mansion, the bluff-top building had 15,000 square feet of space. 6 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms, a foyer larger than most homes, a hot tub, and actual infinity pool nestled alongside. The closets alone stretched into thousands of square feet. The closet was bigger than my house, one visitor later told me. The home, built in 1991, was fit for a prince. Which is why, when he stopped by for the first time in 2004, Theodorin realized that he had to have this property. Little matter that legislators in Washington were publicly debating his family's corruption. They may as well have been on Mars for all he cared. They couldn't touch him, or his money, or his plans. There was one issue, though. All that money Theodorin had been tapping into at Riggs, all that money his family swindled, money that should have gone to schools and hospitals and roads and libraries, was suddenly marked. Everybody following the news knew his money was dirty. Thanks to Senator Levin's hearings and the fact that Riggs had suddenly become the poster child for housing and laundering dirty money, Theodorin could no longer simply open an account in his own name, wire as much money as he wanted to an American bank, or hand it off in shrink-wrapped millions to an American banker for in-person deposits. He would need help sniffing out new destinations for his money, and for that, he knew just what he needed: an American lawyer. The Patriot Act's anti-money laundering provisions, as we saw earlier, imposed a number of new restrictions on U.S. banks and other financial institutions, and created new money laundering crimes regarding funds gained via foreign corruption. Along with banks, real estate agents, luxury goods vendors, and investment advisors, those running things like hedge funds and private equity firms, had all been targeted by American legislators for strict new anti-money laundering regulations, even though they'd since received temporary exemptions from Patriot Act requirements. But there was one glaring omission from the new requirements: lawyers. Despite playing key roles in scandals like the BCCI implosion, American lawyers never got a mention in the Patriot Act's anti-money laundering provisions. There was no legal requirement for American lawyers to ask clients where they got their money from, or run basic due diligence checks on their clients' dirty money. All that mattered was that their clients, American or otherwise, needed legal services, and the deeper the pockets, the better. In reality, anti-money laundering checks for American lawyers are something of an oxymoron. American lawyers can work with whichever clients they want, providing their services to oligarchs or dictators or anyone with a bit of dirty money waiting to be put to use. The American Bar Association, ABA, the primary professional association representing America's legal industry, has issued multiple guidances for attorneys, instructing them how to avoid handling dirty money or how to avoid getting caught in kleptocratic money laundering networks writ large, how to avoid becoming, as experts describe them, enablers, or those enabling the flow of dirty funds into the U.S. And yet, these best practices remain mere suggestions. They're completely voluntary. There's nothing legally binding about them. U.S. lawyers can choose to comply or not as they wish. It makes no difference in the eyes of American law or even in their standing within the ABA or other legal associations. Even with other jurisdictions having moved forward to prevent lawyers from handling dirty money, the European Union issued its first directive requiring member countries to impose anti-money laundering policies way back in 1991, America's legal sector remains unchanged, free of any legal anti-money laundering requirements. A 2016 video sting from the anti-corruption organization Global Witness illustrated just how willingly segments of America's legal sector would roll around in the filthy money pouring in. Posing as an advisor to an African minister looking to move millions in suspect, dirty money, someone like Theodorin, for instance, Global Witness sat down with a dozen different American lawyers to ask their advice on how best to hide the funds in the U.S. and to see how willing they'd be to do so. "We said we needed to get the money into the U.S. without detection," Global Witness wrote. The results, Global Witness found, were shocking. All but one of the lawyers immediately dove into the details of how best to launder the funds in the U.S. and how to obscure any links to the African minister in question. Setting up anonymous shell companies was, of course, a popular theme. Not only would the links between the shell company and the kleptocrat remain concealed, but if the lawyer was involved in the shell company's creation, there would be the added benefit of attorney-client privilege. Another layer of secrecy protecting the kleptocrat in question if anyone asked. But some went even further. A number of the lawyers caught on tape suggested funneling the dirty money directly into the law firm's own bank accounts, effectively mixing the dirty money in with the firm's own funds, and offering cover of the law firm as assurance that the money in question was perfectly above board. One unwitting interviewee, James Silkenat, detailed how the African minister could work around the new anti-money laundering checks American banks were supposed to enforce. The key? Having the lawyers identify which banks were still less than enthusiastic about enforcing the anti-money laundering requirements. Silkenat explained that some banks carry out less rigorous checks on their customers, and he said that he had experience at identifying such banks, Global Witness wrote. As Silkenat told them, we would have to look into how far specific banks look into the Know Your Customer laws and how far they would dig. The kicker? Silkenat was the head of the American Bar Association. Nor were these small-scale firms. Around the same time, the law firms Shearman and Sterling LLP and DLA Piper were intimately involved in a massive billion-dollar Malaysian corruption scheme, and the powerhouse firm Skadden Arps was raking in millions while helping direct shady lobbying efforts out of Ukraine. Small firms, large firms, it didn't seem to matter. All proved more than willing to help their dirty money clients time and again. But again, none of this was illegal. American lawyers remain free to work with whatever clients they want. They can set up shell companies, trusts, or significant purchases for any client. And then, if investigators come knocking, they can claim attorney-client privilege and refuse to reveal any details. It's yet another layer of anonymity and protection to enjoy. In many ways, U.S. lawyers are the perfect friend to have if you're a kleptocrat. The BCCI collapse and the Salinas hearings, the Patriot Act and the resulting Riggs scandal, all of them had upended anti-money laundering realities for American financial institutions. But for American lawyers, almost nothing has changed. Which is why, when Theodorin started searching out new American uses for his money, and for the best way to snap up his Malibu mansion, he sought out lawyers who knew exactly how wide the loopholes for American attorneys remained, and one in particular, a California lawyer named Michael Berger, proved the perfect guide to the remaining and legal loopholes any kleptocrat would need. For those investigators who got to know him, Berger wasn't someone you'd want to spend much time with. He was, at least according to one Senate investigator, a slimeball, someone who, another investigator said, was clearly not a top lawyer. The kind of work Berger seemed to prefer, as one DOJ prosecutor told me, was as unethical as it comes. That's not why I went to law school, the prosecutor said, reflecting on Berger's work. Berger, though, doesn't seem to mind. With a bulbous forehead and stretched smile, the attorney clearly thinks highly of himself. As the site for his law firm reads, Mr. Berger is a Mensa, certified genius, with the intellectual ability to craft creative solutions to even the most difficult legal problems. For Theodorin, as later congressional and court documents revealed, there was one other reason Berger was ideal. Berger's willingness to barrel through legal loopholes, to set up all the anonymous shell companies Theodorin would need, and to scour bank after bank for the most lax anti-money laundering enforcement extant, and then uproot for a new bank whenever they caught on, was a perfect fit for an African kleptocrat with dreams of becoming a California superstar. Based in Los Angeles, Berger initially connected with Theodorin in 2004, just as Levin and his colleagues in Washington began blasting Riggs and broadcasting the rank corruption rotting the Obiang family's wealth. Yet none of those details or revelations ever seemed to perturb Berger. It's unclear how the two of them first met. Berger declined to comment for this book, citing the privilege between myself and my client. Theodorin told him that there was a property just north of them, perched along the Malibu coastline, fit for a prince, that he wanted, and he wanted Berger to help him get it. So Berger got to work, pocketing hundreds of thousands of dollars, as well as numerous other perks along the way. First, Berger called a neighbor, a real estate agent he'd known since the early 1990s. Neil Baden was a Minnesota native who had worked as a real estate agent in the greater Los Angeles area since 1981. Baden later said he'd never heard of Theodorin before Berger's call, and hadn't been closely following the hearings in Washington into the Obiang family's wealth. So when he got a call from Berger, and when Berger told him a wealthy client was looking for someone to help with a delicate and intricate sales transaction, he didn't think twice. Not that there was any reason for him to do so. As we already saw, the Treasury Department had specifically exempted real estate agents like Baden, who at the time worked for the Coldwell Banker Realty firm, from anti-money laundering requirements. As with Berger, there was no legal reason for Baden to check the source of Theodoren's cash flow, to do a due diligence review of him or his family, or even to bother with a cursory Google check. He didn't even need to know Theodoren's identity as his client. Baden would later claim there were no red flags obvious to him. As Baden would tell Senate investigators years later, the real estate agent had no legal obligation to inquire about Theodoren's finances, and such questions made most clients uncomfortable. And he was right. As with the banks before them, for real estate firms, kleptocrats and other high-net-worth clients could appear little different on paper. Dirty money entered the slipstream of capital flowing into American real estate, often looking indistinguishable from other finances tied to celebrities, to media moguls, to billionaires achieving their American dreams. Real estate agents, thanks to the Patriot Act exemption, were under no compunction to check under the hood of the finances, to see if they could track down where it came from and whether their client was actually a kleptocrat searching out their own American dream. Even if they did prod about a client's wealth, they ran the risk that the client would simply look for a different, less curious real estate agent. Plus, what if the client simply used an anonymous shell company? How was the real estate agent supposed to pierce that veil? How was anyone, a real estate agent in California, a banker in Washington, a lawyer filing all the necessary paperwork, supposed to tell if that Delaware shell company behind the purchase was secretly run by a man sitting on billions in ill-gotten gains? And given the amounts of money involved, why would they ever bother to check if there wasn't even a law against it? That October, sitting in a suite at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel, Baden met Theodoren for the first time. Sweeping in with his tailored suit, wide-rimmed glasses, and a model-thin woman on his arm, Theodoren struck him, Baden remembered, as bigger than life. Baden successfully pitched his services to the kleptocrat sitting across from him. A month later, Berger phoned to let Baden know Theodoren wanted to hire him. They drew up a retainer agreement with one goal in mind: obtain the Malibu property. One of the most extraordinary pieces of property I've ever seen in my life, Baden said. The cost was irrelevant. While Baden got to work carving out an agreement with the Malibu property sellers, Berger had other duties in Theodoren's employ. Theodoren, after all, still needed a way to hide all the dirty money he could no longer keep in rigs. And as with so many others, Berger knew precisely where to turn: anonymous American shell companies. In October 2004, the lawyer filed paperwork to create an anonymous American shell company called Beautiful Vision Incorporated. Not long later, he formed a second anonymous shell company for Theodoren dubbed Unlimited Horizon Incorporated. As Berger and Theodoren both intended, the filings for Beautiful Vision and Unlimited Horizon never once mentioned Theodoren by name. Shortly after Berger helped Theodoren create Beautiful Vision, the lawyer swung by a local branch of Bank of America to open a pair of checking accounts in the shell company's name. According to bank records, Berger identified himself as the shell company's owner and president, and then proceeded to navigate the legal loopholes available to him as Theodoren's lawyer. Theodoren had already transferred significant funds into Berger's own attorney-client account at the bank. Berger then transferred some of those funds from the accounts for his law office, which again had no legal obligation to look into Theodoren's blindingly obvious links to foreign corruption, to the shell company accounts. On paper, it looked like the accounts for Berger's law firm had simply started bankrolling shell company accounts, leaving the bank and those inside the bank on the lookout for potential money laundering, none the wiser about the fund's true origins. In just a few months, Berger helped supply the new accounts with the nearly $10 million needed to pay Theodoren's bills and expenses. Still, with the stench of rigs wafting out of Washington, Bank of America grew skittish and started taking a closer look at the shell company account's activities, which had included a series of substantial cash transfers. Internal auditors scoured the account's transactions and discovered a series of suspicious payments, including stays at hotels in Las Vegas and Hawaii and transfers from Equatorial Guinea. It didn't take long for the bank to realize who was really behind the shell company accounts: Theodoren. Less than a year after their opening, both accounts were shuttered by Bank of America. While the bank later admitted it could have moved more quickly to close the accounts, Its anti-money laundering protocols had, on the whole, worked, a testament to the Patriot Act provisions and Carl Levin's efforts in Washington. Except there was one catch. Bank of America allowed Berger to keep his firm's long-standing attorney-client accounts, the ones that had helped funnel millions into the shell company accounts in the first place, open and operating. And even while Bank of America shuttered the shell company accounts, the bank allowed the attorney-client accounts to keep receiving funds, time and again, from Teodorin's accounts in Equatorial Guinea. After all, there was no legislation or regulation requiring the banks to close the attorney-client account. As far as the bank was concerned, they'd followed the letter of the law. The bank closed the shell company accounts, but effectively allowed the rest of the operation to continue as before. That decision, as investigators later discovered, proved the key to keeping Teodorin's entire money laundering operation going. A state-based bank, Union Bank of California, proved just as open. Using the same methods, opening accounts in the names of new shell companies and using the separate law firm accounts at Bank of America as the go-between, Teodorin managed to transfer millions more into his Union Bank of California accounts, and Berger decided to open an account at the new bank for his law firm, initiating yet another stream through which to move the money. Ironically, even though some of the bank's internal auditors flagged a number of the account transactions for review, the bank couldn't act on the questions for months, mainly because the bank was simultaneously negotiating with the Department of Justice over the bank's faulty anti-money laundering systems. Eventually, eyeing the seven-figure sums that kept rolling in and out of the shell company accounts, the bank took a closer look at where the money was coming from and what it was being used for. Sure enough, they concluded that the funds were suspicious. But unlike Bank of America, Union Bank of California specifically singled out Berger for his role. As the bank's own report detailed, the investigation found the use of multiple corporate vehicles by Michael Berger to disguise the identity of Teodorin, as well as layer and integrate funds derived via international wire transactions from a high-risk jurisdiction, Equatorial Guinea, which had the appearance of money laundering activity. The findings couldn't have been starker. Berger had apparently acted as the facilitator of a transnational money laundering scheme. The bank's response was swift, closing all the accounts, including the attorney-client fund in question. Yet Berger and Teodorin were not deterred. There were banks aplenty, all throughout California, to turn to. The two even eyed Citibank, the centerpiece of the Salinas investigations just a few years prior, and opened several new accounts there before the bank realized the accounts were inconsistent with the account profile, closing them before they could do more damage. As court documents later detailed, Berger obfuscated in order to keep the accounts open. As a later complaint filed by the government alleged, when the bank inquired about an account affiliated with Unlimited Horizon, Berger lied that it was to help one of his clients pay a female employee without the client's wife knowing about it. Berger, who kept a file of articles highlighting all the facets of Teodorin's rank corruption, didn't seem to mind his role in helping the kleptocrat move his money. In addition to the six-figure payments Berger earned, documents later revealed that Teodorin had introduced Berger to a lifestyle the lawyer had never known, taking Berger to party after party around Southern California, including one called the Candy Halloween Bash at the Playboy Mansion. In response, Berger couldn't help but gush. "I appreciate the super VIP treatment that you gave me," Berger wrote in one email. "I appreciate you telling your friends that I'm your attorney. I am proud to work for you. The food was great, the drinks were better than great, the house, the view, the DJ, the White Tiger were all so cool." After the Playboy Bash, Berger blushed. "I had an awesome time. I met many beautiful women, and I have the photos, email addresses, and phone numbers to prove it. If the word gets out that you are looking for a bride, women all over the world will go even more crazy for you. Your loyal friend and attorney, Michael Berger." As a journalist at Forbes later quipped, Berger seemed to enjoy the perks of being a kleptocrat's henchman. Along the way, Teodorin also enlisted the help of a second California lawyer. George Nagler had more pedigree than Berger, having graduated from Harvard, and appeared at least a little more scrupulous than Berger. Nagler wasn't so personally despicable as Berger, one Senate investigator told me. Nagler even freely admitted to suspicions about the origins of Teodorin's money. As he later told congressional investigators, he was well aware of the suspect origins of Teodorin's funds. But again, there was nothing on the books, no law, no regulation, forcing Nagler, as an American lawyer, to do anything about those suspicions. It was the same story, time and again. There was Nagler, forming a number of American shell companies on Teodorin's behalf, with names like Sweet Pink Incorporated and Sweetwater Malibu LLC. There was Nagler, opening accounts for the new companies at banks both familiar, Union Bank of California, and new, Cal National Bank, City National Bank, Pacific Mercantile Bank. There were the new accounts sucking up millions directly from Equatorial Guinea or via transfers from Nagler's own law firm account, free for Teodorin to use in the U.S. before the banks ever caught on. One of the accounts actually featured rap megastar Eve as the account holder, which makes sense given that, as we'll see in the next chapter, she'd begun dating Teodorin. On and on the process continued. By the time any bank caught on, it was already too late, and there were numerous other banks to run the same scheme through. It was, said one Senate investigator, a cat-and-mouse game, one made infinitely easier by the fact that Berger and Nagler could freely work with whichever clients they wanted, even those embedded in the most barbaric regimes on the planet. How do they look themselves in the mirror? Rick Messick, an anti-corruption consultant who spent years trying to track Teodorin's crimes, told me. How much money does it take? While Berger and Nagler ran Teodorin's money through a carousel of unsuspecting banks, Baden, Teodorin's real estate agent, was still negotiating with the selling agents at the Malibu mega mansion. Given the magnitude of the purchase, Baden wanted to make sure to hew as closely as possible to Teodorin's instructions, but even that was an uphill battle. Not only would Teodorin regularly ignore Baden's phone calls, but there were numerous times when Teodorin would blow off a scheduled meeting with him, forcing Baden to wait for hours to no avail, even when the two were only a single floor apart. Still, Baden pushed on. After bandying millions back and forth, in early January 2006, Baden and the selling agent finally settled on a number all parties could agree to. $30 million for the house, plus an additional $750,000 for some of the furnishings, in one of the most spectacular home sales in the U.S. that year. And as with the bankers, as with the lawyers,